Today we're going to talk about another way that we can respond to books that we read in reading. So I know we maybe talked about this one time, but has anyone ever heard of a text to self connection? Text to self connection. Does anyone think they know what that is and maybe they could explain it to the class? Eliza?
A text to self connection is when you're reading, like you see like if you eat this breakfast, and then you're not going to eat the same breakfast, that's a text to self connection.
Okay, great. Would anyone like to add on to what Eliza said? Samantha?
Well, it's like something in the book that reminds you of something that happened to you.
Excellent. So something from a book that reminds you of something that happened to yourself. Okay. Does anybody else want to add on anything to what Samantha said? Dale?
Maybe it's if the character makes a mistake in the book, and then you make that same mistake.
So it maybe reminds you of that time that happened to you. Excellent. Amanda, one more? Something that the character did that reminds you of something that maybe happened to you or something that you do too. So I have an example from El Ray Jakes is a Rock Star, now that we're a few chapters in. So on page 31, when El Ray is being really sneaky and he goes and takes the rocks from his dad's rock collection without asking his mom or dad, and then he brings them into school and he doesn't tell them and he doesn't have permission from them to do that. That reminds me of one time I had this really cool new stuffed animal when I was younger, and I really wanted to bring it into school to show all my friends and my classmates and my teachers, and my parents said, no, you cannot bring in your brand new stuffed animal. You don't need a stuffed animal at school, but I snuck it into my backpack and brought it in anyway. So when I read this part about El Ray sneaking around in his house, it reminded me of the time I did a very similar thing, and which I wasn't supposed to do. So that is my example of a text to self connection. So there's also another kind of connection that we've spoken about before that's called text to text. Does anybody think they can come up with an example or explain to the class what it means when you make a text-to-text connection? Thomas?
Maybe like when you read another book, and then you read a different book in a different series, and then they're kind of like the characters are kind of like the same thing.
Excellent. Thumbs up if you agree with what Thomas said. Awesome. Would anyone like to add on? Georgia?
Like it's like basically the same thing as text to self, but instead of comparing it to self, like you compare it to another book.
Excellent. So maybe a character reminds you of a different character in another book? Or maybe something, an event, or something surprising that happens in a book reminds you of another event or something that happens in a different book? Rhea?
Maybe
Can you think of an example from maybe a book that you've read? It doesn't have to be sneaky. You want to think about it? Dale, do you have an example?
So I'm reading Clementine, and Clementine reminds me of her name Mary because, like, when people say Clementine, pay attention, she's paying attention, but to other things that seem interesting to her, not like the basic things like paying attention to her teachers.
Excellent. So now I want to show you some sentence starters that we can use when we either respond to our partners or when we respond maybe in writing on a Post-it in our reading notebook. So strong readers make connections. So if you want to make a text-to-self connection, you can say, this is like my life because. Or you can say, this character reminds me of myself because. So my example with El Ray, I could say, this character, or El Ray Jakes, reminds me of myself because when he snuck into his dad's office and got his rocks and brought them into school, one time I did a very similar thing and I snuck in my stuffed animal and brought that into school also. For text-to-text, you could say this character is like a character in the book and then give the title. So I also think El Ray Jakes reminds me a little bit of Jake Drake because they both kind of have problems in school with bullies. So El Ray Jakes gets bullied sometimes and talks about it, and we learn all about his problems. And a very similar situation happens with Jake Drake at his school. So you can also write about that. Or you can say, this reminds me of, so I could say, El Ray Jakes is a rock star reminds me of Jake Drake Bully Buster, because in both books, the characters get bullied by a peer at school. So what I want you to do now is turn and talk with the person next to you and see if you can think of a time where you can make a text-to-self connection or a text-to-text connection in your books that you are reading. So think about something that maybe something you're reading relates to yourself, or maybe it reminds you of a different book. Okay, so go do that now. Why don't you join me? Can you figure one? Do you have explain what a text-to-self connection is? Okay, go for it. Well, can you share one and then maybe we'll go back? Bum, bada, bum, bum. All right, can you turn your bodies back and face this way? Who would like to share something that they just told their partner? So why don't you tell us if you have a text-to-self connection or a text-to-text connection, and then share with the group what you came up with. Amanda? Loud. So there's sort of a similar problem or conflict in both books, and those are even two totally different series. Excellent. Anya, nice and loud over the air conditioner. Mm-hmm. So what book does that remind you of? Excellent. Maddie? Okay. Andy? And what happens in Heidi Heckelbeck? So that's your example, that you were nervous because in kindergarten you didn't know anybody. So she was nervous when she moved to a new school because she didn't know anybody there, and you felt nervous when you first came to kindergarten because you didn't know. Excellent. Have some of you ever felt nervous when you were going into a new school or a new classroom? You didn't know if you had any friends there or anything? Definitely. Excellent. Okay, so hands down, what we're going to do now is when you go back and read in your books, you're going to think, if you can think of, a text-to-self connection or a text-to-text connection. And you're going to write on a Post-it or in your reading notebook, this is like my life because, okay, or I use any of these 4 sentence starters. And this is another way that we can respond to the books that we read. So who thinks they're ready to do this in their reading today? Does anybody want, actually, who can tell me what we're going to work on today in reading? Who can kind of review what our job is today as readers? Madeline?
We're either write a Post-it or write in our reading book a text-to-text connection or a text-to-self connection, and using one of those 4 sentences on the paper.
To start your idea, right? Okay. Think we're ready to do that? Okay, excellent. So, purple row, why don't you guys go back to your seats and get started?